Mr. President, I'd like to join my colleagues, bipartisan group of colleagues who have been coming down to the floor to talk about the very important bill that we are debating and that we're going to be voting on here in about an hour, and that is to help protect our children all across this country from the horrible scourge of human trafficking, sex trafficking. It's the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act that we are debating right now, and it's important for the whole country. It's certainly important for my state of Alaska. We have a big problem in Alaska with the challenges of domestic violence, of sexual assault, some of the highest rates in the country. We also have a big problem with the challenges of human trafficking, of sex trafficking. A lot of people think, well, that doesn't happen in America. It happens in America. Horrible, horrible issue to talk about, but it happens in our country. As a matter of fact, there was a study last year on young men and women in Alaska receiving services from a homeless shelter for teenagers. Actually, my wife Julie works at this homeless shelter, and 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 5 boys were reported being victims of sex trafficking who used the services of this teen homeless shelter. That's horrible, horrible number. A very vulnerable society that we need to do more to address this issue. And what we do in this legislation, Mr. President, is we're taking the fight to one of the places in this country where human trafficking, sex trafficking has really exploded. And that's the internet. So the bipartisan legislation we are debating right now will ensure that websites and other institutions on the internet and the companies related that knowingly, and that's an important word, knowingly facilitate sex trafficking can be held accountable for their actions. It will also create new federal crimes related to promoting or facilitating human trafficking over the internet and give more resources to state prosecutors to go after these heinous crimes. I think you're seeing in the remarks from a whole host of senators this morning that we're going to make real progress in the fight against online sex trafficking without threatening the years of progress we've made in creating a free and open internet. As Senator Portman, one of the leaders of this effort, along with many other senators, Blumenthal, Senator McCain, his wife Cindy has been a real champion and advocate for human trafficking issues throughout America. So many other senators have been saying this is a common sense, targeted approach to addressing this very big and growing problem. So we're going to vote in about an hour, and I hope all of my colleagues will do the right thing and vote and reject these amendments that are put out there as some kind of helpful amendments, but to be honest, they're meant to bring down the bill. We cannot allow our children, whether in Alaska or across the country, to be lured into this kind of hell. And the more we hear in terms of testimony, the more we recognize that what's going on the internet in this area is hell. Mostly for the youth of America. Our children should not be sold online or anywhere else, and unfortunately, Mr. President, it is happening, and it is happening a lot. Largely because of the internet, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported from 2010 to 2015 an 846% increase of children being trafficked. Over 800% increase in America. Now, I know a lot of Americans just think, wait, really, that's a problem in Asia or in other countries, Southeast Asia? It's a growing problem in the United States of America. We need to address it. As others have said on this floor, sex trafficking has moved from the street corner to the smartphone, where it has been much more difficult to detect, much more difficult to stop. And it's one of the reasons we see this dramatic increase in rates of human trafficking in our countries. Now, Mr. President, we had on the Commerce Committee a hearing that covered this bill. Some of the members of the tech industry were opposed, but I think the overwhelming support that came out of that hearing was driven by the real-world tragedies that we started to hear from. Hundreds, thousands of them across the country that have occurred because of really lax laws and immunity on the internet that was not intended for companies or individuals who deal in sex trafficking and human trafficking. But what we saw from the reports and the investigations that Senator Portman and others did was that that's actually what was happening. So, for example, Senator Blumenthal earlier today was talking about the very moving, really tragically sad, moving testimony that we heard last September in the Commerce Committee from Yvonne Ambrose, whose daughter, 16-year-old Desiree Robinson, was trafficked online by a pimp on the website Backpage. She was later raped and murdered by a 32-year-old man who found her on that website. It's an American citizen, 16-year-old girl. And had you watched the testimony of her mom in front of the Commerce Committee, you'd be voting for this bill today. Her mom ended her riveting and very sad testimony by saying if there were stricter rules in place for posting on these websites, then my child would still be here with us today. It was a wrenching story, and one, unfortunately, that too many American mothers and fathers are telling us. So, we're going to vote on this today, and I hope all my colleagues vote for more progress. But, Mr. President, as you know, there's actually positive progress that's been going on this issue in the Congress. Now, a lot of times when you read the news, whether it's my constituents back home in Alaska or Americans throughout the country, you're always hearing about conflict and how there's no progress in the Senate. And we have some difficult issues, there's no doubt about it. But on a lot of issues, there's been bipartisan progress. And in this area in particular, in terms of human trafficking, there has been significant bipartisan progress to start finally addressing this growing problem in America, which again is remarkable when you think about that. Young men and women trafficked for sex in this country. So in 2017, we passed bipartisan passage of the Abolish Human Trafficking Act. In 2015, we passed the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. Both were introduced by my friend and colleague from Texas, Senator Cornyn. Senator Thune has been a leader on these issues in the last couple years, passing the No Human Trafficking on Our Roads Act and Combating Human Trafficking in Commercial Vehicles Act, which focus on the big problem that we've seen in terms of the transportation system in America being used for human trafficking. Senator Grassley, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, we passed his bill, the Trafficking Victims Protection and Reauthorization Act, which brought more services to victims of these heinous crimes. So, Mr. President, we're making progress, no doubt about it. But this is a very important point. Despite this strong record of addressing human trafficking, when it comes to these crimes, one of the biggest things we need more of in America to address them, because they're growing, is resources. Resources. To put it bluntly, there's too many cases, there's too much of this happening, and not enough resources, money, or prosecutors to put the bad individuals who are doing this behind bars. Now, many of these cases, and you see many cases involving human trafficking, are federal crimes. And that usually requires federal prosecutors to go after these federal offenses. And as we all know, there are limited amounts of assistant U.S. attorneys, federal investigators to do this. So what have we done? What have we done in the past few years? What are we doing today in this vote to help address this? Well, we've begun to change this issue of resources to go after the perpetrators of these heinous crimes in a much better way by allowing state attorneys general, state district attorneys to actually prosecute these crimes, even though they're federal crimes. We are doing something in the law that says we need more prosecutors, we need more investigators, we need more resources. Let's unleash those in the state to help us address this growing problem throughout our country. So we're doing that. And we did it, Mr. President, for the first time in the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act in 2015. Now, this bill, which is, like I said, Senator Cornyn was the lead on this. This bill actually incorporated a bill that I had authored and had a lot of co-sponsors on called the Mann Act Cooperation Act. We put that in as part of the broader bill in 2015. So, Mr. President, the Mann Act is the federal law that makes it a criminal offense to transport someone across state lines for the purposes of prostitution and human trafficking. And in my experience back home in Alaska, as Attorney General, we had challenges in this regard. As a matter of fact, there was a very notorious case of a bad man, a very corrupt man, who a lot of people knew in Alaska. He was engaged in this kind of activity with young girls from the native villages in my state. We investigated this and realized that he violated not a state law, but a federal law. Very clear. Human trafficking, violation of the Mann Act. So, my office, when I was Attorney General, we went to the feds and we said, here you go. Here's the evidence. This guy violated the Mann Act. He's a bad man. He should go to jail. And we need to send a signal. Well, it's a rather long story. It's a sad story, Mr. President. But for whatever reason, and I've wondered for years, and I've looked into this for years, the federal government wouldn't take the case. Wouldn't take the case. So I said to the feds, well, then let my prosecutors take the case. We'll take the case. You just need to cross-designate us. Let the state AG's office take these federal laws. Prosecute them against this guy. We'll do it. They still didn't allow us to do it. There were rumors in Alaska, hey, what was going on here? Was this some kind of deal cut between the feds and this guy, who was a real bad guy, was in jail for something else? But when I got here to the Senate, I said, we are not going to let that kind of injustice happen again. We are not going to let that kind of injustice happen again, because that was an injustice. A man who violated the Mann Act, clearly committed the crime of human trafficking, is a free man right now. Shouldn't be the case. So as part of the Justice for Victims of Human Trafficking Act in 2015, we had a provision, my bill, that essentially said this: if a state attorney general brings a Mann Act, a human trafficking violation case, federal case, to the Attorney General of the United States saying we need to be cross-designated to go do this, to prosecute. Maybe the feds don't have the resources, maybe they don't have the time. Then the Attorney General of the United States shall allow the cross-designation for more state AGs to prosecute these cases, unless it would undermine the administration of justice. So that's in the law. State AGs right now can go prosecute Mann Act cases. That's more resources, more investigators, more prosecutors. And Mr. President, that's going to be in the law we're voting on today. Because one of the elements, an important element of the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act that we're voting on and debating right now, is to allow state attorneys general the power and the authority to bring actions against those who violate federal law for internet-based sex trafficking. So we're bringing the resources in these kind of cases. That's an important innovation and a development in the bill that we're voting on today. So just like in the previous legislation, state AGs can now bring these cases. If we pass this law today, that will mean more resources, more investigators, more prosecutors for the perpetrators of these heinous crimes. So all the bad guys out there who are undertaking these crimes, when we vote to pass this legislation today, that's going to be a bad day for you, because we're going to have more resources and the ability to put you in jail with this vote today. So, Mr. President, as I mentioned, we have a big, big problem in this country. We have a long way to go in terms of human trafficking, sex trafficking, that's really hitting all parts of America. But Congress is focused on it, and I'm hopeful that we'll pass this legislation this afternoon for one more step in the right direction on addressing this. I yield the floor.